I'm Fiona Johnston and squirrel! Oh gosh, that's embarrassing. My ADHD really just showed. However, that's how most people think of ADHD. Just someone instantly getting constantly distracted, jumping off walls, hyper, and that's it. While yes, people like me with ADHD do have issues with concentration and can be hyper or super excited at times, that isn't how it affects us all. ADHD is more than just that. And I'm here to bring more awareness to the stereotype of what people perceive as the hyper kids who just don't want to pay attention, so people can understand a little bit more on how it can affect us. Having been diagnosed with ADHD for 10 years, in this speech, I will explain a little bit more about what people may already know about ADHD, and then we'll go over 2 topics that others might not have known about that also affect those with ADHD: hyperfocusing and rejection sensitivity dysphoria. First, let me explain further on what you may already know about ADHD. ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, is, as the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIMH, writes, a disorder marked by an ongoing pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. Most everyone knows the stereotype that people with ADHD seem to either be poor at paying attention or seem to be overly hyper or even both. This is because there are technically 3 versions of ADHD. ADHD predominantly inattentive, ADHD predominantly hyperactive, and ADHD mix of both types. For someone who is predominantly inattentive, this can mean that, as NIMH writes, a person wanders off task, lacks persistence, has difficulty sustaining focus, and is disorganized. And these problems are not due to defiance or lack of comprehension. This implies that it's not as everyone thinks, that the people are choosing to lose attention. It's not that they don't want to stay focused, it is simply just that this disorder makes it difficult for them to keep their attention, and that they might not even realize or be aware that they are not doing that. On the other hand, although as someone with ADHD grows older, the NIMH informs, hyperactivity seems to lessen. For those who are predominantly hyperactive, and the NIMH says that this means a person seems to move about constantly, including in situations in which it is not appropriate, or excessively fidgets, taps, or talks. In adults, it may be extreme restlessness or wearing others out with constant activity. Now that I've elaborated more on what we already know, let me tell you about something you might not know about. Hyperfocusing. Hyperfocusing is just as it sounds. It is, as Timothy J. Legg, PhD, in the Healthline article ADHD and Hyperfocus, writes, the experience of deep and intense concentration in some people with ADHD. When someone hyperfocuses, they can become so focused in what they are doing that they don't realize what goes on around them or even how much time passes by. Now, this can be helpful and detrimental to someone with ADHD at the same time, especially if they have a learning disability paired with their ADHD, which the Organization of Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, or CHAD, tells us that with ADHD, tells us those with ADHD unfortunately often do. For instance, with hyperfocusing, sometimes I may become completely engrossed with what I am doing, which is wonderful if it is that is what I'm supposed to be doing. However, if I'm completely in the zone on something that isn't work related, that this can cause me to get behind. I may plan to take a short break, and although I plan this break to maybe only be 30 minutes long, it may end up being an hour or even 2 hours without me even realizing it. Another thing you may not know about people with ADHD may have to deal with something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria, or RSD, is only subject to people with ADHD. William W. Dodson, MD, in his article Attention Magazine article Emotional Regulation and Rejection Sensitivity, writes, RSD is an extreme emotional sensitivity and emotional pain triggered by the perception or imagination by the person with ADHD that they have been rejected, been teased, been criticized, disappointed important people in their lives, or withdrawn their own approval of themselves when they failed to attain their own standards or goals. Whether what caused them to feel hurt was true or not, it can make that person feel in an indescribable, immense pain. William W. Dodson, MD, explains that the pain is extreme. Dysphoria is literally Greek for unbearable. The pain is so primitive and overwhelming that people struggle to find any words to describe it. They can talk about its intensity, awful, terrible, catastrophic, and cannot find words to convey the quality of the emotional pain. If this emotional response is internalized, it looks like an instantaneous but triggered major depression. So, as you can tell, ADHD is far more than what people perceive as just a disorder of what appears to be when some kid is hyped up on a sugar rush. Yes, they can struggle with inattentiveness and hyperactivity. However, they're not choosing to pay attention, choosing to not pay attention, and hyperactivity may not be as prominent and symptoms may lessen for adults. People with ADHD can also be affected in other ways, such as hyperfocusing and rejection sensitivity disorder. All in all, ADHD can affect people far differently than how many may believe. This is something that people have to deal with and go through daily. These could be things you had not known of before that can affect people with ADHD. Now you can perhaps understand those around you, or even yourself a little bit better.